How are the fluids of the body organized into compartments?
Okay, within the human body, it's estimated that we could be anywhere from about 60 to 70% water within our body. And so again, depending upon the state of the body, if you're dehydrated or well hydrated, male versus female, body composition, all of those things are going to have an effect on the total amount of water within the body. Different organs are also going to have different amounts of water. And so a dense structure like bone is going to have less water than, say, the connective tissue region underlying the skin. And so, again, these numbers aren't necessarily important, but I'm going to include them for perspective. And so if we're looking at a 70 kilogram male, we're going to have basically about 42 liters of fluid within the body. And again, this fluid isn't kind of sloshing back and forth because we're going to have it located within compartments. We're not a blob. We've got distinct compartments or distinct structures that are going to be present within the body. And so if we focus in kind of on the smallest kind of functional subunit within the body organization, what we're going to have is going to be a cell. Okay, and within the cell, we are going to have things like a nucleus, kind of something like that, maybe some mitochondria, producing ATP that were needed. We've got other kind of components which are going to be found within that. But within this area, we're also going to have what is generally called the cytoplasm, but probably more accurately, the fluid within the cytoplasm is going to be referred to as the cytosol. Okay, and all of this fluid is going to be located inside of the cell. And it's going to have a cell membrane around the outside. That cell membrane is basically going to keep what needs to be inside of the cell inside and what needs to be outside of the cell outside. And so within the cell, what we're going to have is going to be intracellular fluid. So the intracellular fluid is going to be the fluid of the cytosol, or the fluid which is within the cell. And so roughly about 2/3 of the fluid within the body is going to be located within the intracellular fluid. It's going to be located inside of the cells. And so that's going to equate, in our example here, to about 28 liters of fluid. Now, the remainder of that, if it's not going to be inside of the cell, it's going to be outside of the cell. And so intracellular fluid is inside. Outside of the cell, what we're going to have is extracellular fluid. Okay, so extracellular fluid is going to be fluid which is going to be outside of these cells. And so about 1/3 of the fluids within the body are going to be located within this extracellular space. And so this is going to correspond to about 14 liters. Now, if we focus in on this extracellular fluid, we're going to see that there's different, again, compartments or regions within the body where we're going to take this 14 liters of fluid and distribute it. Now, the first thing, and this is potentially a little bit confusing, is that we're looking at inside of the cell versus outside of the cell. But if we look at this really within the human body, we're going to see that there are going to be lots of other cells which are going to be present. Cell 2, cell 3. So basically, we're looking at fluids which are going to be kind of outside of all of these cells. But it's going to be outside of the cells, so it's extracellular fluid, but it's going to be fluid which is within the tissue. And so because of that, the extracellular fluid is sometimes referred to as the interstitial fluid. So the extracellular fluid basically is going to be equaling the interstitial fluid. So it's outside of the cell, extracellular fluid, but it's inside of the tissues. So it's going to be interstitial fluid. Now this is going to be kind of surrounding the cells. Many of the chemical reactions that are going to be occurring within the cells, many of the things that are occurring within the body that are, the proteins are controlling reactions, the enzymes are controlling the rate of the reactions. Basically what we're going to see is that it's going to be occurring either in an aqueous environment inside of the cells in the intracellular fluid, or an aqueous environment outside of the cells in the extracellular fluid, or sometimes referred to as the interstitial fluid. Now there's going to be another fluid compartment, and that other fluid compartment is basically going to be the bloodstream. And so we're going to have fluid-filled, almost like tubes, but fluid-filled organs, fluid-filled vessels, which are going to be transporting blood, transporting this fluid throughout the body. And in doing that, they're going to transport what's going to be carried by the blood. And so we're going to have things, like red blood cells, kind of drawn kind of poorly like this. So we got red blood cells. But again, focusing in on the fluid within the bloodstream, what we're going to have here is going to be referred to as plasma. Plasma, move this over a little bit so you can see it. Plasma is going to be the fluid within the blood vessels. And so what we're going to have is that of that extracellular fluid, of that 14 liters of fluid that's located outside of cells, within the true tissues, within the interstitial fluid, what we're going to have is going to be roughly about 75% of that fluid that's outside. So about 10.5 liters. And again, the exact number is not important. I'm giving it to you perspective. That 10.5 liters is going to be outside of the cells located within the tissue, which means that the plasma is going to have the remaining 25%. And so the plasma is going to correspond to about 3.5 liters of fluid. Okay, so what we're going to see then is that we've got three distinct compartments of fluids within the body. We've got fluids within the cells, located or described as intracellular fluids. We are going to have fluids that are going to be outside of the cells, referred to as extracellular fluids. And these extracellular fluids can be further kind of broken down to whether or not they're in the compartment of the tissues, in which case they'll be the interstitial fluid, or if they're the fluids within the bloodstream, in which they're going to be plasma. So the fluid which is carrying oxygen, or not really oxygen, red blood cells are carrying the oxygen, carrying carbon dioxide, carrying nutrients, carrying ions, carrying hormones that are signaling throughout the body. All of these are going to be suspended within the fluid matrix of the plasma. So we have an aqueous environment of the plasma, an aqueous environment within the interstitial fluid, so still outside of the cells but in the tissues, and then the fluids within the intracellular space, so the intracellular fluids. Now what's going to happen, and we'll talk about this with diffusion and osmosis, is we can have movement of fluids from one compartment to the next. We can have movement of materials from one compartment to the next, but they're basically going to have to cross a boundary. And so for it to go from extracellular fluid in the interstitial space inside of the cell, it's going to have to pass through the cell membrane. So the fluid needs to flow through. The things within, maybe ions, need to be able to pass through the cell membrane in a way that we'll talk about separately. Within the bloodstream, fluids within the plasma can go into the interstitial space by passing through what would be the cellular lining of our blood vessel here. And so we can go back and forth with these fluids, but these boundaries are going to be present. A cell membrane separating inside of the cell versus outside of the cell, basically a layer of cells which is going to be separating the interstitial fluid, the fluid inside of the tissues, from the fluid inside of the bloodstream. And so we've got three compartments that are separated by a boundary that is going to regulate the passage of materials and the passage of fluids from one compartment to the next. And that's going to be important when we take a look at how the body functions, because in order to have life occur, we need to have things inside of the cell staying inside of the cell and things outside of the cell staying outside of the cell. And so we can have separation of materials. We can have the development of concentration gradients. We can accumulate, potentially harmful agents or harmful materials in a distinct location where they were going to be separate from, potentially vulnerable cells or vulnerable structures. And so these tissue compartments then are going to be important for the functioning of the human body.